can't even speak. What?
What if everything you thought you knew about Star Trek was just the surface? Behind the iconic uniforms, alien worlds, and warp-speed adventures lies a treasure trove of hidden details, last-minute fixes, and secrets the creators never meant you to notice. From props made of bubble wrap to emotional real-life dramas, this is the untold story of the franchise that changed sci-fi forever.
NBC had a science fiction series on a while back. You probably remember it. It was called Star Trek.
Star Trek isn't just a science fiction series, it's a cultural touchstone. When NBC first aired the show in 1966, no one could have predicted the global phenomenon it would become. With its starships, alien worlds, and futuristic vision, it shaped how generations imagined space exploration. Over the years, the series has been praised for its memorable characters, bold storytelling, and social commentary. But there's also another layer to Star Trek that many fans don't always notice: the stories behind the stories. Behind all the flashing lights, futuristic uniforms, and alien encounters, there are countless hidden details, creative decisions, and production challenges that shaped what viewers saw on screen. These aren't just trivia bits. They're part of what made the show so impactful. Whether it's about a reused prop or an actor's difficult experience, each detail adds a new dimension to the way we understand the series. Take Grace Lee Whitney, for example. She played Yeoman Janice Rand in the original Star Trek series and was introduced as a key supporting character. Originally, the writers had plans for Rand to be a recurring presence on the bridge, potentially even as a love interest for Captain Kirk, but her time on the show was unexpectedly short. After appearing in just a handful of episodes, she was suddenly written out of the series. At the time, viewers had no clear explanation for her departure. Only years later did Whitney reveal the painful reason behind it. She shared in interviews and her autobiography that during her time on the show, she was assaulted by a studio executive. Although she didn't name the individual publicly, she believed that the trauma from the incident and the complications that followed played a role in her being let go. One of her most memorable and difficult scenes came in the episode The Enemy Within. In this story, a transporter accident creates an evil duplicate of Captain Kirk. This version of Kirk behaves violently and unpredictably. In one disturbing scene, he attempts to assault Janice Rand. Filming the moment was incredibly hard for Whitney, who had already experienced real-life trauma. However, she later said that William Shatner, who played both versions of Kirk in the episode, treated her with professionalism and care during filming. She credited him with helping her get through the uncomfortable moment. After her departure from the original series, Grace Lee Whitney faced personal struggles, including battles with addiction. Yet she remained connected to Star Trek and its fans. She made a return to the franchise years later, appearing in several Star Trek films and even making a guest appearance in the series Voyager. For many viewers, her return was a reminder of the strength she had shown, both on screen and in life. In a later interview, Whitney shared a line that stuck with many fans. Reflecting on her relationship with Spock, she said, "Spock never needed me for my body. He needed me for my feelings." It was a small but powerful insight into how her character was quietly respected within the story, even if that wasn't always obvious at first glance. The line also served as a reflection of her own desire to be seen as more than just a supporting role or a fleeting presence. Stories like Whitney's show just how complex things could be behind the scenes of the original series. While the world of Star Trek seemed clean and hopeful on the surface, the realities of television production in the 1960s were often much harsher, especially for women. The industry at the time had limited protections, and many actresses, including Whitney, faced difficult choices when dealing with personal and professional trauma. Her experience isn't just a sad footnote in Star Trek history. It's a reminder of how entertainment intersects with real human experiences. Whitney's journey from an early exit to a meaningful return, and her openness about the challenges she faced, gave her a unique place in the Star Trek legacy. Fans didn't forget her, and many saw her as someone who brought quiet strength to the show, even in a short amount of time. This kind of behind-the-scenes insight isn't just limited to one actor or one episode. It's part of a broader pattern in Star Trek's history where the struggles of the people involved help shape the show's direction. Whether it was actors pushing for better roles, writers navigating network pressure, or directors working with tight budgets, the human element was always there. In Whitney's case, her departure marked a turning point. Her character wasn't replaced by someone similar. Instead, the show shifted focus to a tighter cast and fewer recurring female roles. This shift reflected both a creative decision and the limitations of the era, but it also meant losing an opportunity to develop a character with real emotional depth. The episode The Enemy Within remains one of the most talked about stories from the original series, partly because of its split personality concept and partly because of what it revealed about power, identity, and control. But knowing what Grace Lee Whitney went through at the time adds another layer to how we interpret it. The scene between Kirk and Rand is no longer just a moment of fictional tension, it becomes a reminder of the emotional weight that some actors had to carry while creating these stories. Years after her return to the franchise, Whitney became a regular at fan conventions. She embraced her role in Star Trek history and often spoke candidly about her journey. Many fans saw her as a survivor, someone who took something painful and turned it into a form of resilience. Her willingness to speak out long before it was common to do so also made her an important figure beyond just Star Trek fandom. In many ways, Grace Lee Whitney's story captures the larger theme of Star Trek itself, the idea that even in the face of adversity, people can find strength, meaning, and connection. Star Trek was always about more than phasers and transporters. It was about people trying to do the right thing, even when it wasn't easy. And sometimes, that effort happened behind the camera just as much as in front of it. Today, more fans are becoming aware of the challenges actors like Whitney faced. With modern conversations around equity, safety, and representation in entertainment, her story has found new relevance. It's part of a growing recognition that the shows we love were shaped not just by visionaries and budgets, but by the real lives and emotions of the people involved. After 2 seasons of building a steady audience, NBC renewed Star Trek for a 3rd season. On paper, this seemed like a victory. Fans had launched a massive letter-writing campaign, urging the network to keep the show going. Their efforts paid off. Sort of. NBC gave the show another season, but with strings attached. The budget was cut drastically by more than 60%. At the same time, the show was moved to a much less favorable time slot, Friday nights at 10 p.m. This scheduling decision was significant. At the time, Friday nights were known as a television dead zone. Many younger viewers, the exact audience Star Trek was beginning to attract, were likely to be out or otherwise occupied. Ratings were bound to dip, and NBC executives knew it. The message was clear. Star Trek could stay, but only under conditions that made it nearly impossible to succeed. It was renewal in name, cancellation in spirit. It was a renewal in name and cancellation in... The budget cuts forced the production team to make difficult compromises. Sets were reused constantly. Special effects, already a challenge given the technology of the 1960s, had to be scaled back even more. Scripts were rewritten to fit smaller budgets, often resulting in less ambitious storytelling. Entire scenes were simplified or cut. The creative freedom that had allowed the first 2 seasons to push boundaries was now under pressure from financial constraints. Gene Roddenberry, the show's creator, was deeply frustrated by NBC's actions. While he had battled with the network before over content and casting, this felt like the final straw. He chose to step back from the show's day-to-day operations during the 3rd season. Without Roddenberry's influence, the series lost some of its original vision and consistency. Though new producers did their best to keep things afloat, the show never fully recovered. Many fans believe that NBC never truly believed in Star Trek. The show didn't fit the standard mold of 1960s television. Its moral themes, diverse cast, and forward-looking storylines were seen as risky. While other shows focused on domestic life or slapstick comedy, Star Trek asked questions about war, race, identity, and technology. It wasn't just science fiction, it was social commentary. That made some executives uncomfortable. The network may have underestimated the long-term appeal of such themes. At the time, ratings were everything, and NBC was looking for immediate results. Star Trek's slow-burning popularity, especially among younger and more educated viewers, didn't fit into their short-term metrics. So rather than fully cancel it and face another wave of fan backlash, they renewed it under conditions that almost guaranteed it would fail. Ironically, it was only after NBC let the show go that Star Trek truly became a cultural icon. Reruns in syndication introduced the series to a wider audience. Over time, its influence grew, inspiring a franchise that would span decades and reach across generations. But the original series ended not with a bang, but with a quiet collapse, brought on by financial limitations and poor scheduling. Beyond network politics, Star Trek also faced its share of personal drama behind the scenes. One of the most enduring relationships in the franchise, both on-screen and off, was between William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy, Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock. Their dynamic became one of the pillars of the series. But off-camera, things were far more complicated. In the early years of the show, Shatter and Nimoy weren't especially close. Shatter, as the lead, expected to be the focus of attention. However, it didn't take long for Nimoy's portrayal of Spock to capture the public's imagination. The character's calm logic and mysterious background resonated with viewers, and his popularity skyrocketed. Reports from the time suggest that Shatner was not entirely comfortable with this shift. He reportedly took issue with how often Spock was getting attention, and at times, more fan mail. The tension wasn't always openly discussed, but it created an undercurrent on set. Over time, however, their working relationship evolved into a genuine friendship. The two actors traveled together for conventions, supported each other through personal milestones, and appeared in multiple interviews where they reflected warmly on their shared history. Yet, even that friendship faced difficulties. In the final years of Leonard Nimoy's life, something changed. According to Shatner, Nimoy suddenly stopped speaking to him with no clear explanation. Many people close to the actors believe the falling out stemmed from a decision Shatner made while filming his 2011 documentary, The Captains. In the documentary, he used footage of Nimoy without formal permission. Nimoy, who had become more private in his later years, apparently saw this as a breach of trust. Shatner later expressed regret about the rift, saying he had tried to reach out but never heard back. When Nimoy passed away in 2015, Shatner did not attend the funeral. He cited a prior charity commitment, but the decision drew criticism from some fans and media outlets. In the years that followed, Shatner spoke openly about his sorrow over the unresolved conflict. He even wrote a book titled Leonard, My 50-Year Friendship with a Remarkable Man, in which he shared stories from their time together and reflected on the complex nature of their relationship. This mix of admiration and misunderstanding highlights how real human emotions often shape the Star Trek experience. While their characters symbolize unity and mutual respect, the actors behind them had to work through egos, personal boundaries, and the pressures of fame. In the end, their partnership still stands as one of the most iconic in television history, precisely because it was grounded in two very real people with all their strengths and flaws. At the same time, the show's behind-the-scenes creativity was being tested in new and unexpected ways. The third season's reduced budget forced the props and costume departments to get more inventive than ever. One of the more surprising examples comes from the Klingons in the episode Day of the Dove. Their uniforms look tough and militaristic, but if you take a closer look at their belts, you might notice something odd. The gold-colored buckles worn by the Klingons weren't made of metal or high-ended materials. In fact, they were made out of ordinary bubble wrap. The production team painted the bubble wrap gold and affixed it to the belts, creating the illusion of some kind of alien technology. On the lower resolution televisions of the 1960S, the texture passed for futuristic detail. It wasn't until decades later, when the show was remastered in high definition, that fans began spotting the familiar bubbly pattern. This kind of improvisation wasn't a one-off. Star Trek's original production team often had to use whatever materials they could find: household items, packaging materials, even parts from model kits. It was a test of both their creativity and resourcefulness. They weren't trying to fool the audience with expensive effects. They were working with constraints and doing the best they could with what was available. The same philosophy applied to other props across the show. Weapons were often repurposed power tools, painted and glued together in new ways. Medical devices were built from laboratory glassware or plastic parts bought from toy shops. The limited budget could have been a setback, but instead it became an opportunity for invention. That spirit of improvisation, combined with the actors' commitment and the writers' willingness to explore serious themes, helped Star Trek carve out a unique space on television. But it's worth remembering that the show didn't have an easy path. It was renewed under punishing terms, ignored by much of the mainstream press, and eventually cancelled before it had a chance to reach its full potential on network television. One of the most instantly recognizable elements of Star Trek is the Vulcan salute, with fingers parted down the middle and the phrase, "Live long and prosper," spoken in a calm, deliberate voice. It quickly became a global gesture of peace and logic. But it wasn't created by a writer or a producer. The salute actually came from Leonard Nimoy himself. And it had roots in his own childhood. Nimoy was raised in a Jewish family in Boston, and he often attended services at an Orthodox synagogue. During one particular ceremony, he witnessed a sacred blessing where a group of men stood before the congregation with their hands raised in a unique formation. Their fingers were parted in the same way that would later become the Vulcan salute. The gesture was meant to represent the Hebrew letter Shin, which has spiritual significance. Nimoy was fascinated by the image. Despite being told by his father not to look during the blessing, he peeked, and the moment left a strong impression on him. Years later, while filming the second season episode Amok Time, Nimoy felt that his character Spock should have a distinct way of greeting others. He suggested the gesture he had seen in synagogue, feeling it would be fitting for the logical and ceremonial culture of Vulcans. The director agreed, and the salute was included in the episode. Audiences responded immediately. It became a lasting symbol not just of Vulcan culture, but of Star Trek as a whole. What many fans don't realize is that it began not as a futuristic idea, but as a spiritual moment from real life. While the salute was deeply personal, the transporter, another of Star Trek's defining inventions, was created for a much more practical reason: saving money. In the early days of production, it became clear that showing the Enterprise landing on a planet in every episode would be far too expensive and time-consuming. Filming a shuttle departure, journey, landing, and return would have required extensive models, sets, and special effects, none of which fit into the show's tight budget or schedule. So the production team came up with a simpler solution. Instead of landing ships, why not beam people directly to and from the planet's surface? Thus, the transporter was born. It allowed the crew to instantly teleport to new locations, with a simple shimmering light and sound effect doing all the work. The idea wasn't rooted in real science, but it made sense within the Star Trek universe. It also helped keep stories moving more quickly by cutting out scenes that otherwise would have added complexity and cost. The transporter made its debut in The Man Trap, the first Star Trek episode broadcast on television. From the very start, it became part of the show's language. The special effects team developed a practical method to create the transport illusion, using light, sound, and fade techniques. Even though it was created out of necessity, the transporter ended up becoming one of Star Trek's most beloved concepts, appearing in every series and almost every episode thereafter. But another part of the Star Trek universe that many people don't notice immediately is tied to James Doohan, the actor who played Montgomery Scotty, Scott, the Enterprise's chief engineer. While his character was famous for keeping the ship running smoothly, the man behind the role carried a hidden piece of history with him. quite literally. Doudan served in the Royal Canadian Artillery during World War II. On D-Day, he landed on Juno Beach as part of the Allied invasion of Normandy. During the fighting, he was shot multiple times by friendly fire. 4 bullets hit his leg, 1 struck his chest, but was stopped by a cigarette case, and another hit his right hand, severing his middle finger. After the war, Doudan turned to acting, and when he joined Star Trek, he made a conscious decision to keep the injury off camera. Through clever hand placement, selective angles, and even using a prosthetic finger or gloves in certain scenes, he was able to hide the missing digit from most viewers. However, if you look closely, you can spot moments in episodes like The Trouble with Tribbles or The Lights of Zetar, where the injury is visible. Most fans had no idea for years. Doudan rarely spoke about the injury publicly, but over time, fans learned more about his service and his bravery. His role in Star Trek, often calming and composed under pressure, gained even more meaning when paired with his real-life story. He wasn't just playing a war hero, he was one. Another hidden detail that reflects the behind-the-scenes politics of the show involves the opening credits. If you go back and carefully watch the beginning of episodes from the original series, you'll notice something peculiar. William Shatner's name is always larger than Leonard Nimoy's. This wasn't a design choice, it was written into the contract. A studio memo from September 1966 stated clearly that Nimoy's name must appear at only 75% the size of Shatner's. This detail reflected the hierarchy that existed during filming. At the time, Shatner was considered the show's lead. Captain Kirk was meant to be the central figure, and Shatner's contract reflected that status. But something unexpected happened once the show aired. Spock quickly became a fan favorite. His calm logic, alien perspective, and emotional restraint connected with viewers in a way no one had predicted. Letters poured in praising Nimoy's performance. Merchandising focused heavily on Spock. He became the face of Star Trek for many fans. This rise in popularity reportedly created some tension. Shatner was said to be uncomfortable sharing the spotlight. Though both actors were professionals on set, their relationship was never entirely free of competition. Despite the growing importance of Nimoy's role, the credit size remained unchanged throughout the series. Only in later seasons was the phrase "also starring" added before Nimoy's name. A small but meaningful nod to his role in the show's success. Even something as simple as a bottle behind the bar had a story in Star Trek. In The Next Generation, fans often spotted a glowing green drink called Aldebaran whiskey, served at 10 Forward, the ship's social lounge. It looked exotic and futuristic, just as you'd expect from a drink served in space. But in reality, the bottles used to serve the drink were just cleaned-out George Dickel whiskey bottles, a Tennessee sour mash whiskey brand found in many liquor stores. The prop department poured in some green-tinted liquid, added a sci-fi label, and placed the bottles on set. That's all it took to turn a bit of Earth booze into a galactic delicacy. The team used similar tricks throughout the series. Romulan ale was just water-dyed blue. Saurian brandy came in fancy glass decanters bought from regular shops. Klingon blood wine was sometimes poured into old wine bottles or even shampoo containers dressed up with labels and wax seals. This kind of creative repurposing wasn't limited to drinks. Borg tools were sometimes made from dental instruments. Dilithium crystals, a key power source in the Star Trek universe, were often just pieces of resin or plastic lit from below. The props team didn't have massive budgets to build complex models from scratch. Instead, they found clever ways to transform everyday items into the stuff of science fiction. What makes all of this even more impressive is how seamlessly it all came together on screen. Viewers weren't distracted by the reused props or simple materials. They believed in the world being presented to them. That belief wasn't just about design, it was about intent. The creative teams behind Star Trek understood that strong ideas and committed performances could make anything feel real, even if it was made out of household objects. Looking back, it's clear that Star Trek's most iconic elements didn't always start with elaborate planning. Sometimes they came from a deeply personal place, like Nimoy's childhood memory. Other times they were born out of necessity, like the transporter. And often they were hidden in plain sight, props and details that only revealed their true nature years later. There's something special about world building in Star Trek. Beyond the characters and the main plot lines, a lot of thought and effort went into the little things. Backgrounds, symbols, gadgets, and even small production jokes that were never meant to be noticed. The deeper you look, the more you realize just how much was happening in the background of the series. Some of these details were accidental, others were deliberate jokes or shortcuts, and many ended up becoming lasting parts of Star Trek lore. One of the things that surprises many fans when they revisit the original series is the variation in uniform badges. Today, the Arrowhead insignia worn by the crew of the Enterprise is considered the symbol of Starfleet as a whole. You see it in nearly every series, film, and official merchandise. But when the original show aired in the 1960s, that badge wasn't meant to represent all of Starfleet, only the Enterprise. At the time, the idea was that every ship had its own unique insignia. The delta-shaped arrowhead was specific to the USS Enterprise. If you pay close attention in episodes like The Doomsday Machine, you'll notice that Commodore Decker and his crew aboard the USS Constellation wear badges with a different design, a sort of swirled shape. Similarly, in the Omega Glory, the crew of the USS Exeter wears rectangular badges with horizontal lines. These subtle differences were easy to miss, especially on old televisions with poor resolution. Most viewers wouldn't have noticed unless they were looking very closely. But for the production team, it was a small way to show diversity among the different crews and ships. This idea was eventually dropped, likely because the Enterprise's badge became so iconic. By the time Star Trek: The Motion Picture was released in 1979, the arrowhead had officially been adopted as the standard Starfleet insignia, used by all personnel across ships and bases. There's a story that within Star Trek's in-universe logic, the Enterprise's 5-year mission was considered so legendary that Starfleet decided to use its badge as the new standard. But the real-world explanation is simpler. It was easier, more recognizable, and more cost-effective to standardize one design. Still, these early badge variations remain a fun piece of trivia for fans who enjoy spotting inconsistencies that later became part of canon. Another behind-the-scenes detail that turned into a fan-favorite Easter egg comes from the original series sets. If you ever look closely at the pipes running through the corridors of the Enterprise, you might see labels that read GNDN. At first glance, this looks like technical jargon, maybe some kind of futuristic engineering system, but it's actually a private joke from the set designers. GNDN stands for Goes Nowhere, Does Nothing. These pipes weren't functional props or tied to any piece of the story. They were just bits of tubing added to make the set look more complex and high-tech. The label was an inside joke that only the production team really understood at the time. It was a small way to have fun while building the show's environment. Over the years, the GNDN pipes became a sort of hidden gem for fans who enjoy uncovering the show's quirks. It wasn't the only time set designers added jokes or personal touches. Many of the props used in sickbay, engineering, and the bridge didn't serve any real function. They were just everyday items modified with buttons, paint, and labels to appear futuristic. What made them work was how the actors interacted with them, as if they were real tools in a real spacefaring environment. By the time Star Trek: The Next Generation came along in the late 1980s, the tradition of hiding jokes and Easter eggs was still going strong. One of the most interesting examples is the Master Systems display on the bridge of the Enterprise D. This was the large, glowing diagram of the ship's structure, often seen behind crew members in engineering or the control room. It was meant to provide a detailed view of the ship's internal systems, showing the various decks and components. What many fans didn't realize at the time is that the display was actually full of hidden surprises. Because the screen was just a large printed decal, the designers had the freedom to include anything they wanted, as long as it wouldn't be visible on camera. Scenic artist Michael Okuda and his team filled the ship's decks with tiny inside jokes, tributes, and strange items. Among the hidden objects were a Porsche, a small silhouette of a vintage aeroplane, a duck, and even a mouse, each tucked away in different parts of the ship's layout. There was also a tiny image of the Nomad space probe from the original series, placed as a tribute to earlier episodes. One of the most bizarre details was a hamster running on a treadmill, jokingly positioned near the warp core, as if it were powering the ship. These additions were never meant to be noticed by viewers. They were inside jokes for the production crew and a way to have fun while designing something that would mostly remain in the background. But with the arrival of high-definition remasters and screen captures, fans eventually discovered them, and they became part of the series' long list of behind-the-scenes stories. Even some of the most basic storytelling concepts in Star Trek have hidden explanations. For example, how is it that every alien species across the galaxy speaks fluent English? From Vulcans to Ferengi to Bajorans, there's rarely any language barrier. In reality, of course, it was a production choice. Having all characters speak English saved time and avoided the need for subtitles or invented languages. But within the Star Trek universe, this is explained by a device called the Universal Translator. It's built into communicators, combogers, and ship systems, allowing for real-time language conversion. The translator doesn't just substitute words, it adjusts grammar, cultural nuance, and tone, allowing characters to communicate as if they were all speaking the same language. The Universal Translator gets referenced in multiple series. In Enterprise, the character Hoshi Sato works to develop the early version of the technology. In Deep Space Nine, the Ferengi struggle to communicate when the translator fails in the episode Little Green Men. And in The Next Generation, the episode Darmok shows the device's limitations when faced with a language built entirely on metaphor and shared experiences. Of course, viewers still have to use a bit of suspension of disbelief. The Universal Translator is said to work so perfectly that it even adjusts mouth movements so the actors' lips match the English dialogue. It's a neat solution that keeps the story flowing while still giving a nod to the idea that communication in a galaxy full of alien life would be far more complex than it appears. Another long-standing mystery in the Star Trek universe is whether money still exists in the future. The franchise often presents a vision of humanity that has moved beyond greed, poverty, and economic inequality. In First Contact, Captain Picard says outright that money doesn't exist in the 24th century, and in other episodes, characters explain that people work to better themselves, not to get rich. But that's only part of the picture. If you watch carefully, you'll notice moments in the original series where money or pay is still mentioned. In one episode, Kirk tells Scotty he's earned his pay for the week. This might have been a figure of speech or just a leftover from the time the episode was written, but it raises questions about how the economy actually works in the Star Trek universe. Within the Federation, most basic needs appear to be provided for. Food, shelter, education, and healthcare are all freely available, likely thanks to replicators and post-scarcity technology. People are driven by curiosity, exploration, and service. But outside the Federation, things are different. On Deep Space Nine, Federation officers use credits to pay for holosuites, food and drinks at Quark's bar. Other species, like the Ferengi, operate on a system of trade and profit, using gold-pressed latinum as currency. This suggests that while Earth may have moved beyond money in its traditional sense, a form of economic exchange still exists, especially when dealing with alien societies. It also means that Starfleet officers sometimes need to participate in these systems when working on diplomatic missions or visiting independent space stations. All of these little details, the badges, the GNBN pipes, the translator, and the Federation's economy, show how deep the Star Trek universe really is. What started as simple production decisions, budget-saving tricks, or jokes among crew members have become pieces of a much larger tapestry. They don't always get explained in full, and some were never meant to be seen at all. But over time, they've helped build a universe that feels rich, consistent, and lived in.